story of Daniel Lizard Hernandez begins deep within the violent underworld of California's prison system, where loyalty, fear, and bloodshed shaped the course of men's lives. Long before he became one of the FBI's most valuable informants, Hernandez was a product of the same ruthless cycle that forged generations of gang leaders behind bars. His rise within the Nuestra Familia was not born of chance. It was the natural result of survival, ambition, and a mastery of manipulation that would one day make him both a revered figure and a condemned traitor. Born and raised in the gritty neighborhoods of Northern California, Hernandez grew up surrounded by poverty and the constant presence of gang culture. Like many young men in his environment, he found belonging in the streets long before he found purpose in legitimate life. Early arrests for drug trafficking and assault only hardened him, pushing him into the very prison system that would define his destiny. Inside those concrete walls, he discovered Nuestra Familia, the ruling syndicate that controlled Northern California's Latino inmates. And it wasn't long before his intelligence and charisma drew the attention of the organization's higher-ups. In prison, reputation is everything. Violence commands respect, but intellect and composure command power. Hernandez had both. He wasn't the kind of soldier who sought chaos for its own sake. He understood structure, profit, and politics. Nuestra Familia was more than a gang. It was a criminal government operating within and beyond prison walls. With a clear chain of command and military-like discipline, it functioned as a shadow institution that governed every aspect of prison life for norteños. Hernandez quickly became one of its most trusted members, his influence expanding from the cell blocks to the streets. By the mid-1990s, Hernandez had become a shot caller within the ranks. As a founding member of Nuestra Raza, the gang's training faction for younger recruits, he oversaw the indoctrination of new members and enforced the iron code of obedience that defined the organization. He orchestrated the smuggling of drugs, weapons, and contraband through carefully coordinated prison channels, turning his cell into a command post. From behind bars, he managed street-level narcotics operations that stretched across Northern California cities like San Jose, Salinas, and Stockton. The profits were immense, but the price of failure was death. Hernandez's authority was built not only on violence, but on trust. Within Nuestra Familia, every word carried weight, and betrayal was an unthinkable act. Yet as law enforcement pressure mounted against the gang, the same intelligence that made Hernandez indispensable would also make him a liability. The FBI had begun to notice his name appearing in intercepted letters, coded phone calls, and debriefings with rival gang members. To the Bureau, he wasn't just another inmate. He was a potential key to dismantling an empire that had eluded them for decades. Operation Black Widow began quietly. In the late 1990s, federal agents devised a plan to infiltrate Nuestra Familia from within. They knew that brute force alone couldn't destroy a structure built on decades of fear and loyalty. They needed someone who understood its inner workings, someone with enough credibility to walk among its leaders without suspicion. Daniel Hernandez fit that description perfectly. At first, he was just another target of their investigation. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized he might be the one man capable of bringing the entire organization down. When federal agents approached Hernandez with the proposition to cooperate, he was a man at a crossroads. Years of incarceration had eroded his faith in the system, and his standing within the gang had placed him in constant danger. Internal power struggles were erupting among Nuestra Familia's upper ranks, and paranoia ran rampant. Rumors of betrayal, misused funds, and unauthorized killings had fractured alliances. Hernandez understood that in the world of prison politics, yesterday's ally could become today's executioner. His survival instinct, sharp as ever, told him it was time to think beyond the gang. Still, the idea of turning against Nuestra Familia wasn't simple treachery. It was suicidal. The gang's reach extended far beyond prison walls, and informants rarely lived long enough to tell their stories. Yet Hernandez had seen enough blood spilled to understand the futility of loyalty when the reward was death. Facing possible life imprisonment and surrounded by enemies on all sides, he made a fateful decision that would alter the history of the gang world forever. He agreed to work with the FBI. To the Bureau, Hernandez was a gold mine. He possessed first-hand knowledge of the gang's leadership structure, communication networks, and financial channels. But to Nuestra Familia, he was still Lizard, the seasoned leader who knew their secrets and commanded their respect. It was this duality, gang boss and informant, that made him the perfect infiltrator. From his prison cell, Hernandez continued to interact with top-ranking members, all while feeding the FBI a steady stream of intelligence that would soon expose the entire hierarchy. As the walls began to close in on Nuestra Familia, Hernandez's transformation was complete. He was no longer just a gangster or survivor. He was a weapon in a war that had been raging for decades. The same cunning that once made him powerful within the gang now served his new masters. In the shadows of California's most dangerous prisons, Daniel Lizard Hernandez was rewriting the rules of betrayal and justice. By the time Daniel Lizard Hernandez began secretly cooperating with the FBI, Nuestra Familia was already under intense scrutiny. The gang's criminal empire had expanded far beyond the prison yards of California, spreading its influence into cities, counties, and neighborhoods through a complex hierarchy of soldiers, regiments, and street lieutenants. Its leaders, most of them incarcerated, directed operations through coded letters and clandestine messages smuggled out by visitors and corrupt intermediaries. For decades, law enforcement had tried to fracture this system, raiding homes, intercepting communications, and arresting soldiers. But every victory seemed temporary. For every member they captured, another rose to replace him. Operation Black Widow sought to change that. Instead of dismantling Nuestra Familia from the outside, federal agents aimed to destroy it from within. Hernandez became the linchpin of this ambitious plan. Under the supervision of the FBI and federal prosecutors, he maintained his cover as a high-ranking Nuestra Familia member, communicating with gang leaders while secretly recording conversations and sharing intelligence. For the Bureau, this was an unprecedented level of access. For Hernandez, it was a dangerous balancing act that could have ended with a knife to the throat if his double life was ever exposed. The FBI began documenting every move. Hernandez helped agents identify key figures within the organization, men like Cornelio Corny, Tristan, Robert Bobby Perez, and others who controlled the gang's operations, both in and out of prison. Through intercepted letters, recorded calls, and covert meetings, the agents slowly pieced together a map of Nuestra Familia's structure. Hernandez's cooperation allowed them to see what had previously been invisible: the rules, codes, and chains of command that govern one of the most disciplined and dangerous prison gangs in America. But Hernandez's role wasn't limited to being an informant. He was still an active participant in the gang's daily operations. That was what made him so effective and, at the same time, so controversial. The FBI needed him to remain credible, which meant he had to continue making decisions, issuing orders, and overseeing operations that often involved violence. As a result, the line between law enforcement asset and criminal leader became blurred. Some agents justified this as a necessary evil, an unavoidable cost of bringing down a powerful syndicate. Others, however, questioned whether the Bureau had lost control of its own informant. Inside the prisons, Hernandez maintained his authority, with the same cold precision he always had. To the outside world, he was still Lizard, the respected Nuestra Familia veteran who commanded obedience. His messages, carefully worded and coded, continued to direct street regiments that moved drugs, collected taxes, and enforced discipline among norteños. But behind the scenes, he was passing those same communications to the FBI, giving federal agents an unprecedented window into the gang's internal politics. He was the bridge between two worlds, the enforcer of one and the betrayer of another. It was during this time that tensions within Nuestra Familia began to boil over. Infighting, greed, and paranoia had taken root among its leadership. With several top commanders serving the life sentences, communication between imprisoned generals and their street counterparts often became distorted, leading to violent misunderstandings and power grabs. Hernandez used these fractures to his advantage. When rival factions began questioning one another's loyalty, he quietly encouraged the chaos, ensuring that the gang's structure weakened from within. The FBI capitalized on this turmoil, deepening their infiltration and collecting evidence faster than ever before. For the agents assigned to Operation Black Widow, Hernandez was both a hero and a headache. His intelligence produced results, real names, real evidence, real arrests, but his methods often skirted the boundaries of legality. He negotiated drug deals, approved violent green lights, and maintained active contact with known killers, all under the justification of preserving his cover. Federal reports later revealed that agents allowed Hernandez to operate with considerable freedom, sometimes even ignoring warnings from local law enforcement about ongoing crimes linked to him. To some observers, it looked less like an infiltration and more like a sanctioned criminal enterprise. Behind the facade of control, however, Hernandez knew the walls were closing in. Word of possible informants had begun to spread among Nuestra Familia members. The gang's upper echelon became increasingly paranoid, conducting internal investigations and demanding proof of loyalty. Men who had been close to Hernandez were questioned, threatened, and in some cases killed. Every time a rumor surfaced, Hernandez had to work twice as hard to maintain his cover. He became more secretive, more careful with his communications, and more manipulative in the way he handled those around him. The double life was consuming him, but it was also his only path to survival. As Operation Black Widow intensified, federal agents began staging coordinated takedowns of Nuestra Familia's regional leaders. Street-level regiments in Salinas, Sacramento, and San Jose were hit simultaneously. Dozens of arrests followed, each based on information Hernandez had provided. Hidden microphones, intercepted letters, and recorded conversations painted a detailed picture of the gang's inner workings. It was one of the most successful infiltration operations in the history of federal law enforcement. But it came at a moral cost that would later haunt both the FBI and Hernandez himself. The deeper Hernandez went, the more he realized that his old life was slipping away. There was no turning back. The men he once called brothers would never forgive him if they discovered the truth. He began to isolate himself, speaking less to other inmates and more to federal handlers. In the sterile conference rooms of federal facilities, he met with agents who promised him protection and a new identity. They spoke of the greater good, of saving lives and dismantling a criminal empire. But Hernandez understood the reality. He was trading one form of control for another. By the early 2000s, Operation Black Widow had reached its breaking point. The FBI had gathered enough evidence to launch one of the largest gang prosecutions in U.S. history. Dozens of Nuestra Familia leaders and associates were indicted on charges ranging from racketeering and conspiracy to murder and drug trafficking. The evidence against them, much of it built on Hernandez's cooperation, was overwhelming. In the shadows, as agents celebrated the impending collapse of one of America's most notorious prison gangs, Hernandez prepared for the next phase of his transformation. He had served his purpose as a weapon, but soon he would become something else entirely. A symbol of betrayal and controversy that would echo through the criminal underworld for years to come. When the indictments from Operation Black Widow were finally unsealed in early 2001, the impact sent shockwaves through California's prison system and the streets that answered to Nuestra Familia. More than 75 members and associates were charged, including some of the gang's most powerful generals. Federal prosecutors announced that the operation had dealt a devastating blow to one of the most organized and feared criminal syndicates in the nation. But behind the triumph and press conferences, a darker story began to emerge, one that centered on the man whose cooperation had made it all possible. Daniel "Lizard" Hernandez. As the trials unfolded, defense attorneys began dissecting the FBI's relationship with Hernandez. They painted a picture of a man who, while posing as an informant, had continued to oversee gang operations and profit from them under the agency's protection. According to their claims, the FBI had effectively sanctioned a criminal leader to run an empire as long as he was feeding them information. They pointed to incidents of extortion, drug trafficking, and violence that occurred while Hernandez was supposedly working for law enforcement. To the defense, this was not justice, it was hypocrisy. The courtroom battles grew increasingly tense. Prosecutors portrayed Hernandez as a courageous insider who risked his life to bring down a murderous organization. They described him as a man who had chosen redemption over loyalty, who had stepped forward to help dismantle a syndicate that thrived on fear and bloodshed. But the defense hammered back with equal force, arguing that Hernandez was motivated by self-preservation, not conscience. They claimed he turned informant only after realizing that Nuestra Familia's leadership was splintering and that his own position within the organization was becoming precarious. In their view, Hernandez wasn't a hero. He was a survivor, playing both sides. Among the most explosive revelations were allegations that Hernandez, while cooperating with the FBI, had ordered or approved violent acts, including the murder of a rival drug dealer. Defense attorneys accused the Bureau of turning a blind eye to these crimes, prioritizing their investigation over human lives. In one instance, internal FBI communications suggested that agents had debated whether to intervene in certain operations Hernandez was linked to, but decided against it to avoid compromising the investigation. The revelations cast a shadow over Operation Black Widow's success, raising questions about how far law enforcement should go to dismantle organized crime. Outside the courtroom, Nuestra Familia was reeling. The indictments had gutted its leadership, but the gang's members refused to fade quietly. From within prison cells, leaders issued coded directives to reorganize and strike back. Word spread that a green light had been issued on Hernandez, an order to kill him on sight for his betrayal. His name became synonymous with treachery, his legacy permanently stained in the eyes of the underworld he once ruled. For Nuestra Familia, loyalty was sacred, and betrayal was unforgivable. Hernandez's decision to work with the FBI had effectively marked him for death. Meanwhile, federal agents faced their own internal turmoil. While Operation Black Widow had achieved its goal on paper, it had also sparked an internal investigation into the FBI's handling of informants. Critics within law enforcement questioned whether the Bureau had allowed Hernandez too much autonomy. Some agents defended the operation, insisting that the magnitude of the bust justified the risks. Others admitted privately that Hernandez had manipulated them, playing the role of a double agent to secure his freedom. The debate revealed an uncomfortable truth. Law enforcement had become dependent on the very criminal they sought to destroy. In prison yards across California, whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire. Younger norteño soldiers, once inspired by the tales of Nuestra Familia's discipline and unity, began questioning their leadership. Some viewed the arrests as proof that the organization had become corrupt and vulnerable. Others saw Hernandez's betrayal as a lesson in paranoia. No one could be trusted, not even the highest-ranking generals. The gang's iron code of silence had been shattered, and with it, the illusion of invincibility that had sustained it for decades. As Hernandez awaited his own sentencing, the weight of his choices began to close in. He had dismantled the empire he once helped build, but in doing so, he had erased his own identity. The FBI had promised him protection, but protection could not undo the past. Every former ally, every surviving soldier, and every sympathizer of Nuestra Familia now viewed him as a traitor, deserving of the most brutal form of retribution. The Bureau prepared to relocate him into the Federal Witness Protection Program, a system designed to give new lives to people whose old ones had been obliterated. For Hernandez, however, a new name could not erase the blood on his hands or the ghosts that followed him. In private debriefings, agents asked him about his motives. Some wanted to believe he had chosen to cooperate out of a genuine desire to stop the violence. Hernandez, however, rarely offered clear answers. He spoke of survival, of opportunity, and of inevitability. He had lived by the code of the prison world long enough to understand that loyalty was just another form of leverage. When the balance of power shifted, he adapted. To him, betrayal wasn't a crime, it was a strategy. And in that sense, Hernandez had outplayed both the gang and the FBI. But survival came with isolation. Hernandez's cooperation had made him a ghost, cut off from the world he once ruled, distrusted even by those who had once called him an ally. He had traded one prison for another, a life of secrecy, fear, and perpetual exile. As the trials concluded and the convicted leaders of Nuestra Familia received life sentences, Hernandez quietly disappeared from the public record. For law enforcement, he was a success story. For the gang, he was a symbol of treason. For himself, he was something else entirely. A man who had walked through every circle of hell and emerged alive, but utterly alone. In the aftermath of Operation Black Widow, the dust settled over a fractured landscape. Nuestra Familia had suffered one of the most devastating blows in its history. Dozens of its leaders imprisoned for life, its communication networks exposed, and its myth of invincibility shattered. Yet even as the FBI declared victory, the ghost of Daniel "Lizard" Hernandez lingered over everything. His betrayal had not only crippled a criminal empire, it had rewritten the moral boundaries of the war against organized crime. To some, he was a necessary evil. To others, he was proof that justice and corruption often share the same face. For the FBI, Hernandez's cooperation was both a triumph and a controversy that refused to die. Internally, debates raged over how far agents should go when handling informants like him. Some investigators saw his case as a model for deep infiltration, an operation that delivered unprecedented results. Others saw it as a cautionary tale, a dangerous example of what happens when law enforcement allows criminals to operate unchecked in the name of progress. Reports surfaced, suggesting that Hernandez had continued authorizing violence even while on the Bureau's payroll, manipulating both sides to his advantage. It was a moral gray zone that no one wanted to claim responsibility for. Meanwhile, inside California's prison system, Nuestra Familia began to rebuild. The arrests had decimated its ranks, but the organization's ideology, its militarized discipline, and unwavering commitment to Northern pride remained alive. New leaders emerged, younger and more ruthless, hardened by the chaos that followed the takedown. They studied the lessons of Black Widow, adopting stricter security protocols and isolating leadership to prevent another infiltration. The name Daniel Hernandez became an eternal warning whispered in the yards and solitary units, a reminder that trust could be fatal. The gang's collective memory turned his betrayal into legend, a story recited to every recruit about the price of disloyalty. For Hernandez himself, life became a paradox of safety and imprisonment. Hidden under the federal witness protection program, he was given a new name, a new identity, and a new chance at freedom. But the life he entered was a hollow one, stripped of the power and respect that had once defined him. He lived under constant watch, never able to return to his family or his roots. Every stranger's glance became a potential threat. Every night brought the same question. Had his decision to betray the gang truly saved him? Or had it condemned him to a slower, quieter death? Years after his cooperation, journalists and true crime researchers tried to uncover what had become of him. Some reports claimed he had relocated out of state, possibly even out of the country. Others suggested that he continued to provide information to federal agencies in exchange for his safety. But no official records confirmed his whereabouts. He had vanished into the machinery of secrecy that the government reserves for those it cannot afford to lose or to be found. For all intents and purposes, Daniel Lizard Hernandez no longer existed, and yet his legacy endured in both worlds he once straddled. Within law enforcement, Operation Black Widow became a benchmark for high-risk infiltration, studied and dissected for its intelligence-gathering successes and its ethical failures. It demonstrated how fragile the line between justice and corruption could become when agencies rely on men born of the criminal underworld to destroy it. Within the gang world, Hernandez's name became synonymous with ultimate betrayal, the kind that not only violates the code but redefines it. His story spread among inmates and soldiers as both a warning and a strange form of admiration. He had done what no one else had dared. He had fooled everyone and survived. The years that followed saw Nuestra Familia continue its endless cycle of violence and rebirth. Federal crackdowns would come in waves: Operation Northern Exposure, Operation Knockout. But the organization persisted, adapting and evolving. Yet none of those later campaigns carried the same psychological impact as Black Widow. The image of a trusted leader turning informant haunted the gang's collective conscience. It was a scar that never faded, a story retold in whispers that mixed fear with resentment. Even decades later, when young norteños are schooled in the history of their cause, the tale of Daniel Lizard Hernandez still surfaces, always ending the same way. Betrayal brings death, even if it takes a lifetime to collect. In truth, Hernandez's fate was less dramatic, but far more tragic. He was a man consumed by his own contradictions, loyalty and betrayal, power and paranoia, survival and loss. His decision to cooperate with the FBI had rewritten his destiny, but had not freed him from it. Whether he lived in quiet anonymity or died in obscurity, he carried with him the burden of knowing he had destroyed both his enemies and himself. The empire he helped dismantle was the same one that had made him who he was. Without it, he was a shadow, powerless, forgotten, and haunted by the faces of men who would have killed him without hesitation. And so the story of Daniel Lizard Hernandez stands as one of the most complex tales in the history of American organized crime. A story where the hero and the villain share the same name. His betrayal crippled Nuestra Familia, yet it also exposed the moral compromises of those who used him. It revealed how far both sides, the gang and the government, were willing to go to win. In the end, Hernandez achieved the one thing most men in his world never did. He lived. But survival came at a cost that no amount of protection could erase. As time moves on and legends of the old prison gangs fade into myth, the legacy of Lizard remains frozen in that gray space between loyalty and survival. His story is not one of redemption or triumph. It is a reminder that in the world of organized crime, there are no heroes, only survivors. And sometimes, survival itself is the greatest betrayal of all.